but I am here today with our special guest, Russ McSpadden. And for everybody, welcome. I'm Melissa Del Bosque. I'm the co-founder, along with Todd Miller, of the Border Chronicle. And this is our Friday live video for our weekly Border Chronicle Roundup, where we recap our reporting for the week at the Border Chronicle. And after the live video, I will publish our roundup, which will include our pieces from this week and important news from across the U.S.-Mexico border region as well. So today, like I mentioned, I've got Russ McSpadden here, who is based in Tucson, like I am. And he's a longtime Borderlands environmental advocate. And our reporter, Caroline Tracy, did a really wonderful Q&A with Russ, which we published on Tuesday on his first poetry book called Borderlands, which is put out by Art Speak Press, which is also based in Tucson. So thank you so much for joining us today, Russ.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Melissa. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and I don't know if the audio is a little funky. I hope you all out there can hear us okay. But for many years, Russ, you've documented the impacts of border wall construction on the environment and wildlife for the nonprofit Center for Biological Diversity, where you work. And I feel like many Americans have stopped paying attention to the border wall construction and to its devastation. They just don't know about it really. Especially this second Trump administration, because I know there's a lot going on, which we'll get into later. And also, folks who are on this live video, feel free to ask questions of Russ, and I'll do my best to field those questions for him. But do you feel with your first poetry book, Borderlands, this is what it looks like, and we have links so folks can buy it on the Q&A that Caroline did on the Border Chronicle. Do you feel like poetry is a different avenue, maybe a better way to reach people about what's happening with the border wall?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not sure that it's, necessarily a better way to reach people. I've spent, a decade talking about the borderlands, through press releases and talking to media. And, in different communications tools, including declarations to courts and lawsuits and that kind of work. I just think that poetry is a different way to talk about the experience of, in particular with this book, the experience of borders, on a much more sort of emotional level, in a language that's very different than the legal language I often use, or the press release type, journalistic language that I use. And yeah, I think the folks that have given me feedback so far on the work, that it does hit differently, to look at the border from the lens of a emotional storytelling. And I think that's one thing that I spent a lot of time working on. I mean, this book really came out of field notes and sort of journals and different things that I was using to process in between all of the work at the border, particularly in the first Trump administration. Watching mountains get blown up for the border wall, and watching springs destroyed, the water drained from them, and wildlife, sort of severed, their population severed. And, there's this sort of unbearableness of doing work in a beautiful landscape where at the same time, that tens of thousands of migrants have died in this place. And it's something that I would bring home with me. And I know a lot of people who work on the border bring home with them this sort of unbearable, almost unsayable heaviness and sort of bruising. Lakin Jordahl, who a lot of people might know, another advocate. A lot of this comes from conversations with him. He had mentioned to me, I hope I'm not revealing too much, but he felt like he had to build a wall around his heart while he was doing some of this work because, it's really intense. And, obviously if it's intense for folks like us working at the border, it's far more intense for people who this wall was really built to stop and harm, migrants. Um, and yeah, I think so. So I don't know. I think that it's just a different way of telling the story, and it's something I needed to do for myself, and I think for my community who works here, to talk about this in a different way.
Yeah, yeah. And for people who are just joining the live video, we're talking with Russ McSpadden, who's just put out a really wonderful poetry book called Borderlines. And there's a really great Q&A by our reporter, Carolyn Tracy, that we published on Tuesday, which I'll be publishing again in our roundup after this conversation. Russ, can you talk a little bit about how you got into doing work on the border and what
Mhm.
made you decide to do a poetry book? Because this is your first poetry book, right? This is your first foray into poetry.
That's correct. I mean, I've written poetry since I was a kid, but this is certainly the first book I published, first book of poems I've published. I got into work at the border through the Center for Biological Diversity, which is, a national environmental organization with a lot of programs, but largely working on public lands and threatened and endangered species and the ecosystems they need to survive. Um, and it's an organization that has always opposed border wall construction from an environmental lens, also with a big heart and acknowledging the human rights issues involved as well. But our real focus is on the ecology of the Sky Island mountains that are a transboundary ecosystem along the Sonora and Arizona border, and these are mountains that are um, a world recognized biodiversity hotspot. And these are mountains right along the border, like the Huachuca Mountains, or the Patagonia Mountains, or Santa Rita Mountains, or the Whetstone Mountains, where bears and jaguars walk on the same trail. I have trail cameras in these mountains, and I've seen both of those species and ocelots and those kinds of species. And so, anytime that there's proposals for new border wall, we certainly snap into action, because it's by and large, border wall is probably the greatest threat to jaguar recovery in the northern range, and especially in the species historic range in the U.S. Southwest. Um, it's a it's the federal government's goal and expressed goal is to build a physical barrier from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico. And this would be the first time that any society has ever walled off an entire continent. That's the entire continent of North America from those two oceans. Nothing like this has ever been done in the past. And the ramifications of it would be absolutely incredible, especially in a time of great climate change, where we know both humans and wildlife are moving north. And what folks will find is a massive barrier that spans from ocean to ocean. If this administration and I would say, a large portion of the population agree with this concept, and I don't think they quite know the full ramifications of it. You had mentioned that people seem to be paying it less attention now, and I think that's true. One, I think the administration is paying less attention. There's not the rallying cry to build the wall. I think the new shiny object is, an expansion of that to the interior of the United States with, border and border patrol and ICE agents and the National Guard being sent into cities for mass roundup. Uh,
It's
um,
mass deportation now. Build the wall. That's the
yeah.
political slogan now for this administration, this
Hmm.
time around. Yeah. But the construction is still very much happening. Can you talk about like what is happening right now and what particularly concerns you?
Yeah, there's a significant amount of new construction has begun in California and the San Diego sector, but also, most near and dear to my heart and my work is um, about 30 miles of border wall. Um, that construction that has started in the San Rafael Valley, south of Tucson, south of Sierra Vista, that would run through, the most important wildlife corridor in the Sky Islands. And this is a place where pronghorn and black bears and mountain lions and porcupine and jaguar and ocelot and all of these species move through this corridor to connect to all these different Sky Islands and to connect to breeding populations in Mexico or breeding populations north of the border. And this wall would really, if it was completed, would be absolutely devastating for that ecosystem in that area. And we've seen other things, just the quasi militarization of the border, where there's national defense areas declared, across the Cabeza to National Wildlife Refuge, and this gives them, a lot of leeway for, just kind of rampant authoritarianism all along the border, and we're seeing more and more of that.
Yeah, I covered the Texas-Mexico border for a long time, and I feel like I know that area well before I moved here to Tucson in 2021, and I really am ashamed to say I didn't know much about this part of the border. I didn't know about Sky Islands, for instance, and I think in the national consciousness and even international, the border is always portrayed as this sort of empty wasteland, right? So it's okay to build, several walls there because nobody lives there. It's a barren place, but in fact, it's a very rich, ecologically with wildlife. And I think you said some really a wonderful thing to Caroline in the Q&A about the Sky Islands and about borders in the Sky Islands, and you approached it in a very different way, and I was wondering if you could talk about that richness.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. I mean, people think of some monolithic site, Sapia-toned dunes, or sort of urban exterior that they see when they imagine the borderlands. But it is, there is no other place in the United States that has more biodiversity than the Sky Islands in southern Arizona and northern Mexico. The numbers of species there are off the charts. But even when you leave the mountains, places like the San Bernardino National Wildlife Refuge, there's some springs right at the border that make up the headwaters of the Rio Yaqui that flows into Mexico. And those springs support upwards of 1,600 species that have been documented there. And that's, it's an incredible, almost outrageous amount of wildlife there. And there was a 10-year study in this valley of, 16 square kilometers, transboundary sort of study area. And it was a 10-year study of bee diversity, and they found 497 species of bees. And if you were to ask someone where is the highest diversity of bees on the planet, they might say the tropics or the rainforest. But it's actually in this creosote field with a handful of springs right at the border of Arizona and Sonora, Mexico. There are more species of bees in that borderlands area than anywhere else on the planet documented to this date. That's just an impossible to believe of the how diverse this landscape can really be.
Yeah, that was really surprising to me,
Yeah.
to learn that, and I've actually been to the Quito Baquito Springs with you before, where you were
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
where you were looking for the endangered, pupfish, or
Yeah, the endangered pupfish and the spring snail and also there's a turtle species there that's also endangered, and they all live in that spring right at the border. And that's a really tragic scene there because that's an Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, and that's both a really important cultural site and sacred site to the Hiached and the Tohono O'odham and several tribes. And the wall is just feet from that spring. And you can see, through documentation that wildlife on the other side of the wall in Mexico come to the wall seeking that spring because for thousands of years, species movements have co-evolved with, knowledge of this incredible spring that's the only water for about 100 miles, the only naturally occurring water for about 100 square miles. And they die at the wall. of thirst that happens. People have been documenting that on the other side. And so the impacts are huge, I think.
Yeah. So you're saying the most troublesome new construction that's happening is through the San Rafael
Yes.
grasslands valley. And that's about 30 miles.
Yeah, it's 27 and a half miles of border wall, and it would cross the watershed of two really incredible rivers, the San Pedro and the Santa Cruz. And talk about biodiversity. The San Pedro River, which is is a border crossing river. It flows from the water flows from the slopes of the mountains in Arizona into Mexico. It turns back around and comes back into the United States. That river has more vertebrate diversity than Yellowstone or Yosemite. So when people think of these really beautiful places in the United States, they may not think about the border. But it's some of these rivers are really a Garden of Eden for wildlife.
Yeah, it's a truly beautiful valley. And has construction already begun there?
Construction has begun. They built, it's such an isolated and remote valley that they've built a man camp, and that's the words that they've used is a man camp out there with a bunch of trailers to house 100 to 150 workers. They've built about a quarter mile of wall. They've started a quarry to mix to get rock for mixing concrete. They're drilling water on site to mix that concrete. And that quarry that they built is in the middle of federally designated jaguar critical habitat. It's in the middle of federally designated critical habitat for Mexican spotted owls. So yeah, the wall is a real nightmare for, I think, the evolutionary history of all the species that have um, you know grown up in this environment.
Yeah, and for folks who are just joining this live video, we're discussing the San Rafael Valley in southern Arizona, where new border wall construction has begun, and it's a very vital wildlife and ecological corridor, very important to wildlife and the environment. And you all can see this full video conversation on the Border Chronicle Weekly Roundup, which I'll post after our conversation. I wanted to ask you if you could read a poem from your book for us.
Yeah, sure.
That would be really wonderful.
Yeah, I'll just read a short one. One thing that really got me into thinking about this book is I spending so much time at the border. I would come home and I would often feel really, um, you know, a lot of unease and even quite nauseous. And I had learned from a friend, John Washington, who I think others know, about during the Berlin Wall, this psychiatrist had looked at this concept of Mauerkrankheit, which is wall sickness, and I started reading about it, and I really feel I was really drawn to it. And so this sort of touches on this. This is a poem called "Peace Inside a Black Hole," and it's just a part of it. During the Cold War, Germans living close to the Berlin Wall suffered increases in rotting teeth, rage, psychosis, increased incidence of self-conversions to ghosts. The German psychiatrist Dietrich Müller-Egman described the phenomenon as Mauerkrankheit, wall sickness. Dietrich was terrified his findings would lead to his arrest by the Stasi, that the ghosts might turn him in to the wall's emptying purposes. In Agua Prieta, school children sit beneath concertina wire and draw in the dirt the infinite spirals of the universe. That's the poem.
Thank you. Thank you. I feel like we need to enter the weekend with some poetry.
Yeah.
We all need more poetry in our lives right now. I appreciate you reading from that. And so please check out Caroline Tracy, our reporter's Q&A with Russ. It's really great. It came out on Tuesday, and I'll be posting it again shortly after this conversation, and you can watch the whole conversation as well in our roundup. And this is Russ's new poetry book. It's really wonderful. Um, we'll have a link so that you can purchase it if you want. And thank you so much, Russ, for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend.